Politics are everywhere, even in sports. And in light of the Olympics right now, thought it'd be a good time to talk a little bit about what's going on with one of my colleagues, Dr. Erik French.
Yep, and this is Dr. Steve Jurek, and we're both over at the Political Science Department at SUNY Brockport. And so I've spent a little bit of time in China. I've studied U.S.-China relations quite a bit, and so it's really interesting to think about the U.S. diplomatic boycott of the Olympics being held in China today and what the consequences might be, what's going on. You know, and this sort of leads us to ask bigger questions about what the intersection of politics and sports is at the end of the day. How involved should politics be in sports?
Right, and actually, you know, and are these just symbolic moves, or is there actually substance behind it? And obviously, the reasons for them can be very heavy.
Yeah, so in this case, the U.S. is engaged in a diplomatic boycott of the Olympics in China. That means our athletes are still competing. It's just no U.S. governmental officials are there in China representing the U.S. government, right? And this can be contrasted with the 2008 Beijing Olympics, where the president of the United States, right, George W. Bush, was in attendance. So nobody from the Biden administration, nobody from the U.S. government is going to be showing up. So why is this, right? So if we take a look at what the U.S. government has said, the key sort of bone of contention is Xinjiang within China, a region of China, and the treatment of Turkic Muslims, especially the Uyghur ethno-linguistic group within Xinjiang province. So what's been going on in Xinjiang? Most of China is sort of dominated by the Han ethnic group, right? Its own ethnic group. Within Xinjiang, there are a number of smaller ethno-linguistic groups, including the Uyghurs, who are ethnically Turkic, who practice Islam by and large, who have sort of a separate identity in some ways from the Han majority in the rest of China. And so partially as a consequence of that, in Xinjiang, there's been some unrest in the past. Some Uyghurs have pushed for greater autonomy, for greater independence. There have even been some groups that have been pushing for separatism, who have engaged in some acts of terrorism. So the Chinese government has tried to address this. Now, if you ask the Chinese government what's going on in Xinjiang, what are you doing in Xinjiang to deal with this? They'll say, well, really all we're doing at the end of the day is providing law and order, securing the region, defeating terrorism, trying to address religious extremism, and we're trying to expand the economy to give Uyghurs more opportunity and try to give them more educational opportunity in particular. We're training them, we are teaching them, we're trying to give them a brighter future. But if we look at independent reporting, if we look at media outlets, if we look at non-governmental organizations, activists, scholars, and what they're saying about what's going on in Xinjiang, if we see some of these reports, it becomes clear that what's going on in Xinjiang is much nastier, much uglier, much more problematic. Right. So we have reports that what is effectively occurring is mass incarceration, where well over 1 million Uyghurs have been interred in what are effectively concentration camps without any hope of challenging their detention, without any fair trial, sometimes just on the suspicion of being connected in a very loose, flimsy way to a religious extremist at some point in the past. And within these camps, you know, there are allegations of some pretty ugly things happening. So torture, forced labor, political indoctrination, and in some cases, sexual violence, forced sterilization, forced abortions by Uyghur women. And so this has led to the accusation that what's going on in Xinjiang is effectively a genocide, that the Chinese government is trying to constrict the births of Uyghurs to eliminate them as a distinctive ethno-linguistic group. And this has led the United States and others to label this an act of genocide.
So even though it's symbolic in a way, it's still, it's relevant. It's their way of being able to say, this is the reason why we didn't show up.
Yeah, so it's an effort to draw attention to the issue in some ways and to show that the United States isn't going to continue business as usual with China in some ways while this continues to go on, because we view this as a fundamental challenge to prevailing international norms about human rights, about crimes against humanity, about the prevention of genocide. Now, it is still sort of a symbolic gesture at the end of the day, because what's happening in Xinjiang is not going to change because of this. This is more the U.S. signaling its displeasure. It gives some of our partners and allies an opportunity to also signal their displeasure. So the United Kingdom, Australia, I believe Canada as well have joined this diplomatic boycott. And so they sort of are showing solidarity with the U.S. here. But this won't change the actual outcome in the region, unfortunately. It just serves to point it out, to sort of name and shame China in some ways.
Which has been done before in the past. past too. Yes. I mean, politics has been involved in kind of posturing in the Olympics before. And, we've talked about it, with the 1980s, the Soviet Union and the United States, of course, being involved in the Cold War. The 1980 Winter Olympics were a big deal, and the United States was able to beat the Soviet hockey team in Lake Placid, and that was a big deal. And they go on to win the medal against Finland. And then in the summer, because this is when the Olympics were held together, Winter and Summer Games were in the same year. Then the Soviet Union, and this invasion of Afghanistan is going on, and we say, well, who's going to participate in the Moscow Summer Games, right? And so the United States and its allies said, no, we're not going to do this, right? And the same thing happened then in 1984. So the Winter Games are in Sarajevo in Bosnia. So Winter Games are played, and then the boycott of the Summer Game happens that year in LA. The Soviet Union decides not to show it. So its Eastern European allies say, well, we're not going to join in solidarity. Yeah. Does that matter? And
at the end of the day, it's posturing. Now, those Olympics boycotts were more extensive, right? Because athletes weren't allowed to show up. In some ways,
and it was 65 countries when the United States led the boycott of the Moscow Games. And then, it was the Eastern European camp and a couple of others with the Soviet Union in 84, much less. But still, it was East versus West.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, again, it is posturing at the end of the day. The boycott of the Olympics didn't change the fact that the Soviets were invading Afghanistan, were intervening in Afghanistan. But it is a way and sports have always been a way for countries to show their displeasure with a particular policy. And actually, while Beijing, right, will say we want to keep politics out of sports, the U.S. shouldn't be bringing politics like Xinjiang into the Olympics, China actually has a long history of bringing politics into sports in some ways.
Right, because they didn't participate for much of the Cold War. And instead we had several different versions of Chinese representation. So maybe you can chat a little bit about that.
Yeah, so to understand what was going on, the People's Republic of China, Communist China, what we regard as China today, the Chinese state today, didn't participate in many Olympics in the early Cold War period, really up until 1980 or so. And to understand that, we actually have to go back to the Chinese Civil War.
Mao Zedong, Chiang Kai-shek, and then we really have to mine the past to get to this.
In 1949, these communist rebels overthrew the previous government, the Republic of China under the Nationalist Party, and established the People's Republic of China, this new state in mainland China. The Republic of China government, losing this civil war, fled to the island of Taiwan, right off the coast, right off of mainland China, and set up a temporary headquarters there in Taipei. And so what happens actually is most of the international community continues to recognize that Republic of China government located in Taipei as the rightful government of all of China, including mainland China, which is now under communist control. So as a consequence of that, the Republic of China ends up competing frequently in the Olympics under the Republic of China flag.
And winning.
And doing well.
Medals.
Under the name Republic of China. And so the Communist Party, in control of the People's Republic in Beijing, boycotts the Olympics because they will say, these are rebels. This is an illegitimate government. They shouldn't be allowed to compete. Now, over time, as international recognition shifted more to Beijing, right, even the U.S. eventually recognizes the People's Republic.
Well, the shift in the United Nations Security Council.
Absolutely.
Because the seat was originally recognized by the seat in Taipei, and then all of a sudden the United States says, no, wait a second, okay, now we'll recognize Beijing. So that was a pretty important.
Absolutely. The U.S. abrogates its alliance with Taiwan, stops having a military alliance with the Republic of China. As a result of these shifts in geopolitics, basically now Taiwanese athletes compete under the label of Chinese Taipei, right? And so they have a different flag and everything else. And all of that does is sort of tacitly, implicitly recognize the legitimacy of the People's Republic of China, the communist government in Beijing, rather than the Republic of China. So Taiwanese athletes can still compete, but at the Olympics, they are not recognized as sort of citizens of their own country, right?
Well, the story even gets more complicated, and I don't want to tip my hand too much, but I'm Generation X. So growing up, I would notice that the announcers were tying themselves into knots trying to explain how there's these multiple Chinas, because during the 80s, there was also, and into the 90s, Hong Kong was also competing.
Sure. Yeah, and I'm sure the announcers tying themselves into knots infuriates Beijing in some ways, because especially if they're saying, oh, there's multiple Chinas competing.
Right.
That contradicts.
Because it's only one true China, according to the People's Republic of China.
Yeah, the People's Republic of China has forcefully said in the past, this is really important to the legitimacy of the current Communist Party, that there's but one China, right? One of the claims to legitimacy that props up the Communist Party in China is the claim to have reunified China after a century of humiliation. And so they will say, even Taiwan, that is just part of one China. It's just controlled by these rebels, right, who we don't recognize. And so that's very important to China in Chinese politics, and it has played a role at the Olympics in the past.
Right, and it should be Hong Kong no longer can compete individually because
so they have a different flag
Chinese
now.
sovereignty now.
Yeah, it's been shifted from being under the British Empire.
The 99-year lease is up.
Yeah. So, and actually Hong Kong comes into this as well, because it's another complaint that the U.S. government has with China is its treatment of Hong Kong, which for a long time enjoyed significant sort of political, economic autonomy.
Sure. And there's been lots of protests.
Yeah.
As recently as 2019 and 2020.
And there were really expectations among a lot of people in Hong Kong that they would eventually become more and more democratic in terms of how they were governed. That hasn't been borne out. And indeed, the central government in Beijing has exercised more and more control, has been more and more intrusive in suppressing dissent and political speech in Hong Kong. And so partially as a consequence of that, there have been protests and pushback. And as a consequence of that, really, the Chinese government has cracked down much harder on dissent within Hong Kong. And so the United States government has protested that, said this is an infringement on your people's basic civil liberties. And that's another justification that the U.S. government has given for why their diplomats are not attending this event.
Right. So politics gets involved in everything.
Yeah,
and even if maybe sometimes it is symbolic, it is a way to show a spotlight on certain issues, or at least highlight why there's grievances between countries, and at least it's kind of marking that spot.
Yeah, and there have been other boycotts too throughout history of the Olympics. So I think in '76 there was a boycott by many African states of the Olympics because of some problem with New Zealand.
New Zealand participated in a South African football tournament.
They ended up participating. So they violated this sports boycott of the apartheid regime in South Africa. And because New Zealand was then still able to participate in the Olympics, many African states who wanted to show their solidarity, wanted to show that they were strongly opposed to the apartheid regime in South Africa, then boycotted the Olympics.
Right.
Yeah. So it's really hard to disentangle sports and politics, especially when we're dealing with it at the international level, right? So, I mean, sports play other roles in politics too. Oftentimes, Olympics are big coming out moments for countries that have been growing. That's something else I've been thinking about. Going back to the 2008 Olympics in China, when I was over in Beijing for a while, you can still see all the facilities. They're really magnificent, right? Really striking, some of the facilities that were built for the Olympic Games. And this was, in some ways, a moment for the People's Republic of China to show off to the world in some sense, see how far we've come since the days of the Great Leap Forward and mass starvation and famine, see how far we've come from the Cultural Revolution and the chaos that sort of engulfed our country then. Now we're rich, now we're able to field all of these excellent athletes, we're able to put on this great show. And so Olympics can oftentimes play that role as well. A similar thing with South Korea too. Yeah,
well, it costs a lot of money to host the games.
It does.
For sure. And you can ask Greece and Brazil about that. Building stadiums that are now empty, and some would argue that helped to actually bankrupt Greece because they had access to cheap euro money, and they built these stadiums and they hosted the games in the early 2000s, was it 2004, I believe. And they have not recovered. And the sovereign debt crisis wasn't exposed for a few more years. And yet, it was largely the Olympics we're hosting them. The Athens Games were a big deal. And Brazil, very similarly, also spent a tremendous amount of money in order to have the Olympics come and to showcase your country. But then you're left with these brand new stadiums that you have no other use for. So that's kind of a little,
They're good tourist attractions after the fact, but there's always the question of whether it's worth the investment.
Right.
So. But Actually, something we had talked about earlier that is interesting is the sort of relations between Russia and China, and the fact that Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin recently had this meeting sort of on the sidelines of the Olympics in some ways.
Because Putin did show up to this one, but yet the athletes didn't compete officially under the Russian Federation because of the doping scandals. And so they're under the Olympic Committee, something like that. And so they're not actually representing the Russian Federation, but Putin was there.
Yeah.
And it was a spectacle when he was, attending the opening ceremony, because when the Ukrainian delegation came across, he was seen to look the other way or roll his eyes or however other people wanted to interpret it. But either way, it was clearly a snub.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin have taken this opportunity to strengthen ties and in some ways to display greater solidarity in the face of what they both see as pressure from the West, from the United States, from some of U.S. allies. And so we had this very newsworthy joint statement between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, between China and Russia, which announced sort of the importance of their strategic partnership, announced sort of their shared interest in promoting their own ideas about democracy, right?
Democracy, Russian
so
style.
So to speak,
yes.
Chinese and Russian style democracy. They will both claim they have democratic systems. They're just not Western liberal style democracies, right? And so to some extent, this joint statement that they've given provides them an opportunity to give one another's systems of government greater legitimacy, greater support. It's also given them the opportunity to jointly say, right, we sort of oppose NATO expansion in Europe, what Russia is very much concerned about. And from the Russian side, supporting the Chinese, we oppose any moves by Taiwan toward greater independence, toward permanent separation from mainland China. And so there's a lot of solidarity in these statements. They've attracted a lot of attention.
And the U.S. Navy's over there too.
Sure. So, I mean, so both countries, there's sort of the question of why are the two countries working more closely together now than in the past? And some of it is just a shared perception that the United States is a common adversary in some sense. Now, the partnership is a long way from being some type of formal alliance.
Right.
I've heard news outlets describing it as sort of like a new Axis powers, but it's not. I mean, even the Axis powers weren't much of a formal alliance at the end of the day, and this is not a formal alliance. It doesn't look like the two countries are going to be working together militarily to intervene in Ukraine or intervene in Taiwan. Neither has the power projection capability necessarily to go abroad to a different region and conduct sustained military operations there, have a big impact on battlefield outcomes. Instead, what they're sort of doing is providing more diplomatic support for one another's
I'm pretty
positions.
sure the Chinese-Russian border is still fortified.
Sure, absolutely. And there's a lack of trust between the two countries. Even as they say, we stand in solidarity with one another, there is a long history of mistrust there, going back many, many years.
Right.
And so they're a long way from forming some type of alignment that can carry out a two-front war, for instance, against the United States. We had some commentators saying, well, what if Putin attacks Ukraine and the next day China invades Taiwan? And I think we're a long way from the two countries being able to trust one another enough that they'd be willing to try to conduct synchronized
to coordinate
military
some sort of
operations
aggression, right?
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. That doesn't mean it's not possible, right? One of the things that we have to acknowledge in political science and international studies is that prediction is incredibly difficult.
Right. And the thing you're supposed to stay up at night worrying about is what you don't know is coming, right?
Yeah.
The unexpected is what the thing is going to really catch us off guard, because we can make plans and contingencies for all kinds of things, but that kind of gets us off track.
It does.
The bottom line is what sports and politics, unfortunately, are mixed together. And we've seen it play out lots of times. It can be symbolic. There is posturing, but it also does bring, a world attention to certain issues, and that is relevant and that does matter.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So thanks for listening to us today. If you want to learn more about these issues, international political economy, international studies, political science in a comparative context, regionally, Asian politics, European politics, the interconnection, U.S. foreign policy, political science, international studies.
At SUNY Brockport. Yeah, come check us out.